Between the Prophet Rev 2, Prophet 6, OB6, and Prophet 5, Sequential already has a broad selection in the mid to high-end analog poly market. So maybe you were as surprised as me when they announced another entry into the segment. Today we'll take a look at this new synth to see if it deserves to sit alongside its more distinguished brethren. I'm Donald Jordan for Bloom Music, and this is the Sequential Take 5. With now 5 different polyphonic analog synth offerings, you could be forgiven for getting confused trying to decide which sequential synth is for you, especially since the majority of them are named some variation of Prophet. I think I can clear up some of that confusion today, but first, let's take a look at the Take 5's architecture. The Take 5 is a 5-voice polyphonic analog synthesizer. It sports plenty of knobs across a large panel and features a guitar keyboard with velocity and aftertouch. Each voice boasts 2 full-range triangle core oscillators with variable wave shapes, along with an octave-down square wave sub-oscillator. A mixer section lets you dial in your oscillator blends and also has noise and FM controls. The filter is a 24 decibel per octave low-pass unit with a dedicated drive control. There are 2 5-stage envelopes on board with a simple but effective routing matrix. You get 2 LFOs, one a standard monophonic, and the other an incredibly useful and uncommon polyphonic LFO. Modulation is routed via a 16-slot matrix with 19 sources and 54 destinations. There are 2 master effects, one a multi-effect and one a dedicated reverb with independent controls. And you also have an onboard arpeggiator and sequencer. Around back are the expected power, MIDI, and audio connections. So does all this add up to a synth that can stand proud in Sequential's crowded polyphonic lineup? Let's take a look at Take 5's individual components to decide. Take 5 houses 2 oscillators with identical controls for octave, tuning, and wave shape. Those familiar with Sequential's other offerings will notice some unique things here. First is the change to an octave switch for coarse tuning instead of note tuning. I like this so much better. I've always found the note tuning cumbersome, and I'm happy to see this gone. The other major departure is the inclusion of a sine wave. The Take 5 uses an SSI 2130 triangle core VCO, instead of the saw core VCOs found in their other synths. It's my understanding that triangle core VCOs are better at producing sine waves, so it makes sense to see one here. Nowhere else in Sequential's existing lineup, nor in the lineage of DSI instruments or in any of the classic Prophet models will you find a sine wave, and this instantly sets this instrument apart. Before we even consider the filter or modulation, we can already have a sound that isn't available on most other analog polysynths. Sweep the wave knob clockwise, and you blend in a saw wave. Again, because Sequential opted for the triangle core VCO, you get a different saw than with their other available synths. It's still very sequential, but if you were expecting it to sound exactly like a Prophet 5, you'll be disappointed. Continue to sweep the knob and you'll pass through the square wave, through pulse, and all the way to silence. Of course, this shape can be modulated for moving textures, and you've also got a button to sync oscillator 2 to 1. You'll set the level of the two oscillators in the mixer section, along with the sub-oscillator and noise levels. The sub is tied to oscillator 1, and it is a square type. I know square waves allow for a more aggressive bottom end, but I really prefer the more round bottom end of sines or triangle for my subs, and it's one of the gripes I have about the synth. The sub would have been a perfect place for a triangle wave, since the triangle was replaced by a sine on the main oscillators. For noise, we have both pink and white available on opposite sides of the knob range, which is a nice addition. Finally, you can engage frequency modulation between the two oscillators with this button, and the oscillator 2 knob becomes a depth control. The Take 5 uses the new SSI 2140 filter chip, which was designed to be a modern replacement for the 2040 used in the original Prophet 5. It sounds excellent. That has that classic brassy woof that is the reason to get a sequential synth. Slowly turn up the resonance and you'll find a broad range of usability. Almost the whole knob is sweet spot. It's not until you get to about 3 o'clock that the resonance really takes over, and even then it's not overbearing. A big part of this sound is the resonance compensation, again, something not found on Sequential's other polys. Crank the resonance to the moon and you never lose your bottom end. While I love this feature, I do wish it was defeatable. In some cases, especially when trying to recreate classic patches, that bottom end loss is quite literally part of the sound. It's one of the few Prophet places the Take 5 just can't go. Finally, in the filter section, we have a drive knob. This turned out to be much more subtle than I was anticipating. The drive seems to be focused in the bottom end. When cranked, the low end just gets a little bigger and woollier. As you introduce more sources from the mixer, the effect becomes slightly more pronounced, but never overbearing. The most interesting thing about the drive, and where it is most obvious, is what it does to the resonance when cranked. It kind of mushes the resonance back into your sound, compresses it almost, drastically changing the balance between your sources and the resonance peaks. This allows you to have squelching resonance that blends with your sound rather than sitting a mile above it. Very cool. Overall, I like the way this drive sounds, but I prefer the subtlety. Don't expect brute factor levels of drive here. Modulation is where the Take 5 really starts to come into its own. On the right side of the panel are two 5-stage envelopes. Rather than just tying one to the filter and one to the amp, the Take 5 gives you a little more flexibility to make quick routing changes with the included routing matrix. Pressing the button allows you to cycle through the most common routing configurations without having to mess with the modulation matrix, though that functionality is there for both envelopes if you want to select a non-standard routing. The envelopes are plenty snappy and also have some ridiculously long release times, which I like. Though the envelopes are 5 stages, the delay stage can only be accessed via the program menu, which is counterintuitive since everything else is right there within the main control section. But it's better to have an envelope delay in a menu than not at all. One of the best parts of this synth is the LFO section. You get one regular monophonic LFO that behaves pretty much as you'd expect, but the second LFO is polyphonic. This is a standout feature, and if I'm not mistaken, the only polyphonic analog synth on the market right now that has it. Of course, you can do something similar with cross-mod on the Prophets and OB6, but then you're down an oscillator and it's nowhere near as flexible as it is here. The polyphonic LFO means you can have out-of-phase per-voice modulation. This allows for some really thick organic sounds. You can take this even further when you introduce the modulation matrix and assign LFO2's rate as a target. Set LFO2 to modulate oscillator 1's pitch, and now you've got an LFO that modulates the pitch at a different rate per voice. Listen to the pitch and phase interplay between oscillator 1 and 2 and how each voice is unique. Your Prophet can't do that. The 16-slot modulation matrix allows for bonkers patch complexity, and there are some awesome sources and destinations. There are plenty of audio rate modulations possible, as oscillator 2, noise, filter out, and audio out are all available modulation sources. But my favorite is the voice spread source, which sends a unique value per voice. These kinds of modulations that vary per voice give the synth a lush, lifelike quality that you often don't get with other synths. This is where the Take 5 truly shines. I don't usually cover features like a sequencer because usually there's nothing special about them and everybody knows how they work. However, I wanted to mention the Take 5 sequencer because it behaves in a way I haven't seen before. Most synths, when a sequence is playing and you play the keyboard, it simply transposes the sequence. But the Take 5 allows you to actually play notes over the sequence, assuming you have the voices for it. In the world of advanced sequencers and DAWs, I don't usually care about onboard synth sequencers, but I thought it was an interesting quirk worth mentioning. Vintage mode is one of those things where I've been using synthesizers without it for 20 years, but now that I have it, I don't ever want to go back. It's so good. Vintage mode introduces variations between voices in oscillator tuning, filter frequency, and the envelope stages. Even if they can't quite articulate why, we've all heard people wax nostalgic about vintage synthesizers and how they had a life and sound to them that modern instruments don't. A lot of that life came from the imperfections and instability of the electronics of the time, which caused variations and inconsistencies from voice to voice. Back then, they called those variations errors, but now we know they were the magic. This one knob is like a time machine that reintroduces the imperfections that made those old synthesizers feel alive. Despite usually being an effects snob when it comes to built-in effects, I found the effects in the Take 5 very usable, and in the case of the reverb, actually pretty good. This is a major improvement for Sequential because I did not like the effects in my Prophet 6 very much at all. I almost never used the reverb. But by contrast, and to my surprise, I found myself using the reverb on the Take 5 all the time because it consistently made my patches sound better. The big improvement is the reverb filter control, which lets you apply a low or high pass filter to the wet signal. This allows you to really dial in your reverb's tone so that it tucks in nicely. I often used it to reinforce my patches, kind of add an intangible lushness to them that you don't really hear as reverb, but you miss it when it's gone. It's very nice. The multi-effects section has a good collection of delays and modulation effects, and even a useful high-pass filter. They're all usable, nothing terrible, but the standout effect is definitely the reverb. On the opposite end of the keyboard from the effects section, all by its lonesome, is the overdrive knob. This is just personal taste, but I'm not a big fan of post-filter overdrives and distortions on synths, especially polysynths. Monophonic distortion on a polysynth just doesn't work great, but it can be okay for mono patches. In contrast to the filter drive, which stayed mellow and didn't introduce any high-frequency harshness, the overdrive gets a little messy. Again, just not my cup of tea, but it's there if you want it. I found it most useful at very low settings, for example, to emulate the tinge of breakup on a heavy chord, like an old-school electronic piano. I really like the Take 5. This review took a lot longer than anticipated because every time I sat down to work on it, I'd end up getting sidetracked, just getting lost in the fun of creating patches. At first glance, and maybe on the spec sheet, the Take 5 may look like a pretty rudimentary instrument, but I would urge you to get your hands on one and really listen to it. You can read about it all day, but you need to actually experience it, the sound of that classic filter, the vintage mode, the unique modulation options, and hear how all those things can come together and take you to places that you won't get to with other synths. And I haven't even mentioned the price, $1,300. I cannot reconcile how Sequential was able to sell this synth at that price. That's less than half the Prophet 6 and nearly a third of the price of the Prophet 5. And I know I said this before, but I'll repeat it, this synth will go places those Prophets can't go. Now, Prophet 5 is obviously a very different kind of instrument. I mean, the thing is basically an art piece. The level of quality and craftsmanship you get with that instrument is second to none. The Take 5 ain't that. No one is going to be especially impressed by it. It's not a conversation piece. But if you set aside the prestige and judge purely on the merits of sound and capability, the Take 5 stands tall against its Prophet siblings, and in some ways, actually bests them. If you'd like to hear more of the Take 5 with no talking, click on the Sounds Only video link. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more synth and audio production related content in the future, please like and subscribe.